Now, the loss of lives, the loss of livelihoods, an inability to use business premises, government wage subsidies, back-to-back media coverage, concerns around mental health and family violence, billions of dollars in infrastructure spending, unprecedented government intervention. I refer, of course, to the aftermath of the Canterbury earthquakes that began in 2010. However, you'll note the parallels with the current challenges of COVID-19. Whilst the recovery from the earthquakes is not quite yet fully complete, we do at least have 10 years of hindsight and reflection, and certainly this evening an exemplary panel of speakers to share their insights with us. Now, I'd like to begin by introducing Roger Sutton. Now, Roger is the CEO of Mid-Canterbury Electricity Lines Company EA Networks. He was CEO of Christchurch-based Orion Networks during the Canterbury earthquakes and subsequently the CEO of the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority. He has recently served as the Christchurch Anglican Missioner, and as a professional director, he's been on electricity lines boards in both the North and South Islands. He's got a degree from the University of Canterbury in mechanical engineering and is a member of the Institute of Directors. So, Roger, as we've moved from level 4 to level 3, what have you been looking forward to? What's changed in your life?
I'm looking forward to my local Indian takeaway, Indian Pearl. I'm looking forward to actually popping in there after this tonight and picking up some takeaways will hopefully keep me and the family happy tonight.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully we can hold your attention for the full duration of our event. Now, next, Dr. Bernhard Walker is an Associate Professor at the University of Canterbury. He specialises in leadership, crisis management, organisational agility and resilience. He coordinates leadership development in the UC MBA program. And together with Dr. Nillikant, he co-led a series of research programs following the Canterbury earthquakes, including a $500,000 3-year study on infrastructure resilience funded by MB. And Bernhard, what's been giving you some excitement as we've moved from level 4 to level 3?
I've just come off the back of an interview with RNZ about exactly the same topic. It's, I guess, one of the things that, as a reality check, is that we don't need to see this as a linear kind of progression, that we're going to have exactly 2 weeks and so many days going on level this to level that, because it's still working with the guys in health sciences. It's a pretty volatile situation and it's fairly unpredictable. So that's enough to keep you on your toes at the moment, really.
Sounds like an answer that's not quite the answer that I was looking for, but that's all good. Now, Dr. Venkat Nillikant, now you're an adjunct associate professor at the University of Canterbury, and you've specialised in the management of change, disaster management, organisational resilience over the last 30 years. In addition to the infrastructure resilience study funded by MB following the earthquakes, you've also recently led a study on digital capability based on surveys for New Zealand and Australian organisations. And what's been changing in your life in recent times?
Not much. I retired on January 31st and dived straight into this crisis. So for me, not much has changed in terms of social kind of networking and so on. I've got my own projects. I'm working on a book now. It's going to be a book on how to succeed in an uncertain world.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes.
Now, Nillikant, can I begin, I guess, by asking around definition of resilience? So this evening, we're talking a lot about resilience, so we better get our definition right. So what does resilience mean to you? Okay,
Lloyd, that's a very good question, because resilience does mean different things to different people. For example, when we're doing our research, we found that there are actually more than 64 definitions of resilience in the research literature on resilience. So we have a very specific meaning and definition of resilience. And what we mean by resilience is rapid adaptation to change. So that's what we mean by resilience. You can, the common sense definition of resilience is bouncing back. We include bouncing forward in it. So we see every crisis is also an opportunity, and resilience is rapidly adapting to that crisis so that you bounce forward, not back.
That's excellent. No, it's a good definition that even I can remember, which is fantastic. Now, Roger, I'll turn to you. Now, you've led teams, you've led leaders, you've led organisations in situations of crisis. What does resilience mean to you? Just your microphone there.
How about now?
There we go. That's right. So I'll let you bounce forward.
I think for me, it simply means keeping going when the environment changes, and then adapting to being whatever's needed to actually continue to deliver something to your customers or your stakeholders. So it's that recovering quickly and being able to adapt to new environments is this way I brought it to my people. Okay,
well, I mean that's really good. It certainly fits in with that academic definition as well. And Bernhard, we often, I guess, think of resilience more in an individual sense rather than an organisational sense. So what would you like to highlight around that distinction? Does an organisation full of resilient individuals per se add up to a resilient organisation?
Not necessarily. Obviously, if your people aren't resilient in the first place, you don't have that foundation, but you could have, the classic 100 super resilient people in an organisation, but if they can't do anything collectively, then it's not going anywhere as an organisation. So what we talk about is a series of capacities that the organisation has working together collectively to do these kinds of things. And so they're centered around capacities. We can talk about those shortly in terms of learning, collaboration, creating employee-centric environments. Just having people who have a good diet, lots of exercise and positive mindsets on their own won't achieve that.
Would anyone else like to weigh in there and the difference between individual and organisational resilience?
I mean, I tell the story when I was running Orion many years ago. We had a big snowstorm and power was out to large parts of the Canterbury Plains, and it was going to be days and days before we got everyone's power back on. And I went into our call centre on the first day, and I remember coming across one of the call centre people, Marie, and I said, "How's it going, Marie?" And she looked up and said, "Actually, Roger, it's going crap. You're doing a bullshit job. I've nearly had enough. I'm about to go home." I went, "Ugh. Oh, this is kind of exciting." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She says, "Well, actually, I don't have any information. I can't tell anybody when the power's coming back on. All you're doing is fixing stuff. We're not actually talking to customers about when it's going to happen. And they ring up and they just want to know when. And I just have to give them lies. And I've had enough and I'm about to go." And I went, wow. So, I mean, it was a really good example of actually an organisation that was resilient, and that in fact the frontline staff was willing to tell me to my face that she thought we're doing a really, really average job. And that's kind of an interesting question about kind of organisations that are resilient. If I'd outsourced that function to a call centre somewhere, and we're doing such an average job, would the manager of that call centre have told me, "Actually, Roger, I think you're doing an average job. We're all about to go home. This is just a rubbish operation you're running." So I think that's a very interesting question on resilience, to what extent you outsource and insource, because often outsourcing has got the ability you can get rid of costs more quickly. They can be more specialised, but bad news travels much more slowly. And I think in this environment of rapid change, of people potentially getting sick or systems shutting down, you're much more likely to get that feedback when you're not outsourcing so much, because bad news travels much quickly in a well-oiled, resilient organisation. How about that?
Sounds pretty good. What would you, Nilikan, what do you think around that sort of speed of information flow? Has that been a factor that you would prioritise?
Absolutely. We found from our research that organizations which are very transparent and open about communication in general are more resilient, they're more adaptable. And so, the kind of example that Roger talked about, although he did get that bad news, but he was willing to listen to it, and there was a culture where the frontline employee felt comfortable sharing that information with the chief executive. So that's the kind of culture we aim to create if you want to make your organization resilient, where people can talk openly without fear of consequences, and the communication is transparent and it is honest. And I know these are pretty simple things, but very hard to implement in practice. Does that make sense?
I think so. Someone's actually just asked a question that I think is quite relevant to bring up here as well. It's just around, in this current situation that we're in now, we have to rely on a lot of information flows from outside experts on the TV, on our news feeds all the time.
Yes.
So how do you have a culture that gives the right weighting to their information, I guess, in different phases?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, and I actually have a lot to say on that, but I'll just restrict myself to a few words. The first thing I want to say is that the current crisis is an unfamiliar crisis. It is a new crisis. That's why we call it a novel coronavirus. We never experienced it before. So we don't really have any experts on it. There is no one who can be an expert on a new crisis that the world hasn't experienced before. And I would be a little skeptical about listening to expert predictions on what's going to happen in the future, because quite frankly, the future is going to be unpredictable. Beyond 3 months, it's very hard to forecast what's going to happen in the next 9 months, 12 months, 18 months. We do know, however, that it's going to be a very different world 18 months from now. But how different, what will be different, those are very hard things to predict. So I think you should listen to people from outside. You should listen to all inputs, but be very discriminating in what you accept and what you take on board. Because just because someone is an expert or has some qualifications in a past crisis, and we are on the same boat, it doesn't mean that they know exactly how to deal with a new crisis.
Okay, can I come in? I mean, I think one point I'd make is the need to change out leaders from time to time. I think in problems with a lot of ambiguity, where the way forward isn't clear, you need to change out leaders. And I think that was a real failing of me at Sarah. I think we've done much more of changing out of leaders, fresh perspectives on problems, because otherwise I think get far too linked into what that particular leadership group thinks. So changing out leaders regularly, I think, is a really strong, smart thing to do.
Yeah. Bernhard, do you have any views on that?
I'm inclined to go back and just look at the foundation that we're working on, which goes back to this whole business of creating those cultures in your organization. And those cultures are around that people-centric kind of way of working, so that people are not feeling disenfranchised, not feeling disengaged. There's that ability to talk and contribute. And then moving from there, there's that whole sense of collaboration, so that you've got that knowledge of learning from each other. You don't have silos, you have the involvement across the organization. And then from there, then you can get that ability to move forward and learn. And that's pooling the knowledge from a whole lot of different sources, experimenting, risk-taking, an environment where it's safe to do that, and exploring a very unfamiliar situation. Those are, to me, the keys. I think one of the other things that goes with that is having a really good, solid senior leadership team that work together cohesively and are empowered to get on and do and try things, so that their unity spreads through the rest of the organization. It's that kind of culture that becomes quite important. And these were what we saw as the winning organizations, or the better performing organizations, right from the time of the quake. And if you look at what's happening now in terms of the notions of agile organizations, it's really an echo of the same kind of thing, just in different frameworks that they're talking about. It's the same concept, just expressed in different ways.
That's right.
So when we talk about adaptive resilience, do you feel that's very much a synonym for agile and other words people are using there?
Agile, sorry, Nilikan, you go.
No, you go.
Agile, Agile comes from a specific context of software development and then being used in project management and things like that. and it's been generalized out to other organizations. But when you look at the essence of it, of that ability to do iterative learning, during an event, in this case, during a crisis, taking, trialing things, learning from them, experimenting, and going through that way, using a collective kind of approach. Those are the sort of the core similarities that I see. Nilakant?
Exactly. I think what's going to be crucial going forward is the ability to learn rapidly, and that means you don't wait for a perfect solution or a perfect product. Create a prototype, test it, get feedback, modify it. That's what Agile organizations are all about. That's the concept of agility in software development. So we have to create a similar culture in an organization now, where we try new things, get feedback on it, and involve as many people as possible in designing it and testing it, and then learn from that and modify it and go forward. So that's what's going to differentiate organizations, probably not immediately, but definitely after 12-18 months.
Yeah, I mean, I always, when I'm talking about some of the Christchurch earthquake experience around that, that adaptive resilience, I talk about the 10% rule. I talk about the $35 million temporary rugby stadium. $35 million, $500 million for the permanent one. Did we do well building a quick, fast one in 100 days? The transitional cathedral was 8 million. Fixing the old one is 100. The container more. We should have done a lot more under that 10% rule. Imagine where tourism would have been in Christchurch if we actually had very quickly built a $40 million convention centre with some hotels around it really quickly, rather than waiting for this incredibly grand $500 million convention centre. So I think they're fast. The electricity is the same. Instead of taking a month to get the power back onto some customers, if within a few days I get everybody enough power at their houses, not to run their stoves or their water heaters or their heating, but to run the lights, the Wi-Fi, and the fridge. That's about 10% of your energy needs, and it's about 80% of the value. And I think at these sort of times, you've got to think about what's in the 10% rule. Who are the key people? Who are the key customers? How can you get everybody a little bit quickly? So that's why I always talk about the 10% rule in these environments, and I could talk all day about the 10% rule.
Fantastic. Well, you've kind of made me curious now as to what would apply in the current circumstance. I guess countries like New Zealand that are facing COVID-19, what would fall in that 10% bucket?
Well, I mean, the first one would be things like the comms to our people. Every day communicating to our own staff about what's going on, even if it's only a little bit. Every day giving them something. Every day passing on some other message. I always say that messages that are 90% right told quickly are nearly always superior to messages that are 99% right told slowly. Although politicians will tend to go with the 99% right told slowly because they just hate getting anything wrong. But within our own organizations where trust is so key and fundamental, our people want to hear what we think the truth is right now so they can plan from that. So I think the fast, quick comms to everybody is a really fundamental part of that. How about that?
Yeah, that sounds like good to move on to communications. So Bernhard, what do you think of any specific thoughts around communications, organizations in this sort of situation?
When you're looking at communications, it's part of that relationship, and it's that trust kind of thing that we talked about before, that if you have that culture where there's the balance obviously between overload and under-informing. But if you get an organization, if you have a leader who's very focused, they make one of their priorities communication, honest, open communication, and they work on that every day. That's one of the key conduits for forming that kind of relationship and sustaining it. So if you look at engagement, if you look at people's willingness to innovate and take risks, those things are all tempered to some extent by doing that. Now, when you're looking around that, obviously communication on its own is not enough. And so it's creating a whole leadership culture that is supportive of openness, transparency. The learning that Nilakant talked about before comes from creating that psychological safety, that people can ask questions, So communication isn't just one way, that you can give feedback about what the issues are. Roger's example at the beginning about the receptionist who call centre person, that's the two-way discussion so that people can actually put in honest accounts. If you look at the failure of Nokia, one of the accounts of what went wrong with Nokia was that there was a whole culture of fear where people couldn't speak up and actually say what was going on in the organisation, where the problems were. So that two-way communication is quite pivotal. And the other thing that we've consistently found is that it's an empathetic kind of communication. It's a good leader who understands where their people are at and can speak directly to that in plain, simple human terms. They can give the picture of what's going on, they can convey the technical stuff, but they're also relating as they're communicating. And that's quite an important chemistry to have going to form that resilience of your organisation.
Now, what if I guess you're a board member or you're a senior executive and you realise that your organisation has still got a ways to go when it comes to developing better psychological safety, developing a learning culture, developing the kind of things that you said are fundamental to having adaptive resilience. Is now a time where they can still make some progress?
Yep. I guess a couple of thoughts on that. The first is that I think directors have really got an important role, and it's becoming increasingly important as they can actually be conduits. Because what I'm hearing at the moment from some of the forums that I'm connected with is that people are saying that having directors coming on and asking to see the dashboards of what's happening in their particular organisation is actually quite relevant, because they're bringing information and insights from other organisations that they're also directors for. And so expecting to see that information is steering the management level of the organisation to what they should be focusing on. And if I was making suggestions for a director in terms of the pulse check that they'd be doing on an organisation, I'd really want to know what that overall, is it an employee-centric kind of culture that's happening in the organisation? How do you measure it? Well, you'd look at engagement and areas like that. And then you have to look at a lot more sort of nuanced, subtle aspects around that, but to know that there's really a people-centric culture there. And then I'd want to know what kind of, is it siloed or is there collaboration? Are the leaders of this organisation deliberately reaching out outside of the organisation, seeking that information themselves, maybe in parallel to what's coming through from directors, and trying to get those other links so that you're pooling ideas, insights, sharing, gaining that ability to move forward and process information. And then I'd want to know exactly what's happening in terms of the organisation's risk-taking and learning. What are they thinking? Are they unlearning old behaviours that don't fit anymore and taking on this kind of situational awareness of what's actually happening in this current situation? Are they really in tune with that and making plans at that kind of the strategic level and the operational level, so that they're moving forward and doing these regular check-ins on what we tried this, what's happening now, getting that kind of feedback that Milliken talked about before. To me, that's the vital health check that a director should be looking at. Milliken?
I think, Lloyd, I think the situation that we are faced with now, people just should use common sense. You know, you have a situation where 4 weeks of social isolation, people have been locked up in their homes. They have no idea what's going on outside. The cities are all deserted. All their familiar life has disappeared. They're uncertain about their future. So they're anxious, they're going to be stressed, and they're looking for hope and optimism. They're looking for reassurance. And that's what communication should be about right now. It should be about reassuring people. It should be about providing that psychological safety. And I would do exactly what Roger suggested: communicate daily, communicate. You don't have to be 100% accurate in what you communicate, but it's important to be open, transparent, and honest. And the most important thing is to give people a sense of hope, a sense of direction. And that's exactly is the kind of communication that is required right now as businesses go back to restarting and ensuring that they actually survive and continue. That's phase 1. We can talk about phase 2 later, which is going to be quite different.
Yeah. I was just going to quickly talk about it. We've run some pre-mortems in the organisation, So, you know, post-mortem is after somebody's died or the organisation has died. A pre-mortem is a process where you get a bunch of people together from the organisation together in a room, and you say, look, imagine this has been a terrible, terrible failure. You know, we've failed. This is 6 months' time. You know, in my company, we've almost completely gone under. Tell us what went wrong. So it's a way of getting people from throughout the organisation, the naysayers in some cases, to talk really openly and honestly about what they can potentially see is going to go wrong. Often in organisations, the people who can see the dark side, the negative people, we hide them, we suppress them, we don't allow them to have a voice. Here's a way of getting them to speak openly and honestly and identify the things that can potentially are about to go wrong. And we found it a very, very useful process on this little business I'm running. We ended up thinking about some things we otherwise wouldn't have thought of, but also we've discovered some people from other parts of the organisation we almost didn't know existed, people who actually saw things quite strategically who we otherwise wouldn't have heard from. So I think have a think about running a pre-mortem in your organisation, a way of getting people from throughout the business to have a voice about what potentially is going to go wrong in the next 6 months. There's a fantastic podcast by the Free Economics people on this, Free Economics Radio. So if you can go and Google Failure is Your Friend, Failure is Your Friend, Free Economics, it's a very good podcast on how to run one of these pre-mortems. Get people from throughout the organisation talking. Listen to them, make it safe for them to say what they really think is potentially going to go wrong, because we love being optimistic, we love being positive, but we also want to hear from the naysayers. What do they think? Where do they think our exposures really are? How about that?
I'd be right with you on that one, Roger. It's the whole thing of getting the backroom conversations into the main discussion table where people can say those kinds of things.
Well, they come up with these ideas which are great now, but they're great in peacetime. They're going to give me a mandate to do some changes around the organisation I wouldn't normally have, because these ideas have come from the shop floor, and the person in my organisation I ran my pre-mortems, I didn't even really know she existed, and she's been fantastic. Sorry to be enthusiastic. I'll stop.
Sounds like there's no contentiousness with that technique. It's a path. So we'll join to the pre-mortem opportunities as they come along. Now, I guess I introduced this event by highlighting some of the similarities with the situation around the earthquakes. But are there some quite distinct differences? Obviously, there are some differences with the nature of the challenge that we're facing. Do some of those differences impact on what leaders need to do with organisations now?
I think one of the basic things is the incredible diversity in terms of people's experiences of COVID, so that you have some people who are bursting to get out and do things. You'll have others who are very reluctant to go back. Their sense of risk is a lot higher. The needs around that will be quite variable. Now, obviously in the quakes, there was a lot of variation there, but this is a very kind of subtle personal kind of thing in terms of personal health rather than just your buildings. And that's going to be a challenge for organizations and leaders to be in touch with all those variations that are there. The common thread, I guess, is that, it's the same kind of thing. It's this uncertain, we were living with earthquakes of not knowing if there's going to be another major aftershock and things like that. So those commonalities are still the same sort of things that we're dealing with here. Roger, you're about to say?
Well, but people talk about these things not being a sprint, but being a marathon. You've heard people say that. I say it's not a marathon. It's much more like a really arduous multi-day adventure race. You've got to get from Christchurch to I don't know, to Nelson across the backcountry. You don't know the route. You know who's on your team. And it goes on, and you don't know when it's going to end. You need to collaborate with your competitors. You're finding your way up some jolly riverbed, and you've come across some other competitors. Can you slow down, stop, and ask for their advice? You sleep in a hut with a bunch of Swedish backpackers who've done a similar route to what you're about to do. Have you got the patience to stop and listen and hear what their lessons and experiences were? Have you got the courage to rest and sleep, or you're just going to kind of fight on? Do you communicate with your other team members? I think it's a very, very good parallel, this whole adventure race thing. And the other one is, with the adventure race thing, you suddenly come to a bluff, you come to a cliff, and you can't get around it. Have you got the courage to go, we've taken on the wrong route here, we need to go back? So don't think about this as just a sort of a sprint where you know where you're going. Think about this as a really long, arduous adventure race where you may have to change team members, you may need to bring team members in, but the leaders matter. Leaders will give each other confidence, give each other courage, support people, because you're often in these races only as strong as your weakest team member. How about that?
Well, you've convinced me so much, Roger, with that great analogy. Is adventure racing part of your toolbox of team building?
I haven't done any adventure racing with my people here, but it's a way of thinking about it. You know, that whole thing that if you're in the backcountry, you suddenly have got to cross a glacier. And actually, does anybody here know about finding crevasses before we go across this glacier? Because actually, if we fall into a crevasse, this whole thing is over. You know, it's also about the whole length of this thing. We don't know how long this thing's going to go for. And also have leaders, have we got the courage to actually say, actually, I'm so tired, I'm going to drop out, and we're going to bring someone else in to take my place as well. Leaders have got the courage to do that sort of thing as well.
Really good analogy. Yep, sums it up well.
Millikan, you look like your background there looks like you've enjoyed a bit of adventure racing over the years. Have you seen evidence, I guess, of the organisations that you've talked to describing things in similar terms?
I completely agree with Roger. I think the Canterbury earthquake was a marathon. It mainly affected Canterbury. The rest of New Zealand was not affected, mostly, and definitely the rest of the world was not affected. Despite the heavy loss of life and property destruction, we knew that one day things are going to be rebuilt, and the path to rebuilding was fairly clear. And this is very important. A lot of insurance money poured into the Canterbury region to make that happen. So resources were not a major constraint. This crisis is different. We do not have an end date. We don't know whether a successful vaccine would actually be discovered in the next 12, 18, or even 6 months, as some people claim. And we don't know if there's going to be a viable treatment option. We don't know whether this virus is here to stay, and so on. So there's a lot of unknowns at this stage. A lot of those unknowns will become knowns over a period of time. But it's going to be very much like an adventure race that Roger talks about. And I would say that there's not going to be any single leader who is going to be there from start to finish in this adventure race. So you're probably going to have different leaders coming at different points of time, doing their bits. Some will be good in some parts and some others in some other parts. But the most important thing is learning as you go along and adapting yourself to the environment that you face. Although I have never taken part in an adventure race, that's what it's all about.
I'm sure. So it's keep the dream alive.
Yeah. The other note I make here is I think sometimes as leaders we need to show other people from the organisation about some realities. Directors who are getting grumpy with us, or who don't quite get how hard it is for our frontline staff, or the reality of customers, bring them in and show them, get them to experience it. I remember one time when I was at the Sarah job, I was showing the head of the Treasury, the head of the Prime Minister's department around the red zone. And I came out of a house with these guys all in suits, and someone saw us and they stopped and got out of his car and he said, "Roger Sutton, what are you doing here? What are you doing with men in suits? We don't need men in suits. We need men in overalls to fix some stuff. You're a really big disappointment, Roger. Why don't you just go fix something, mate?" And he got in his car and drove off. And I remember the head of the PM's department, as we got in the car and drove off, he said, "Roger, no one ever speaks to me like that in Wellington, ever, And I think that whole thing, often in life, with these things, we need to take other leaders and show them the reality of what we're facing. Otherwise, they just don't get it. Whether they be us senior executives showing directors or the other way around, we need to make sure everybody really gets it. You need to feel it, you need to see it, you need to experience it before you really believe it.
Now we've got about another 10, 15 minutes before we're going to just address the Q&A things that have come through. Now, I think we've got a few slides and things we might show you just to reinforce some of the points we're talking about. Before we move to that, I do have a question around, back to the earthquakes again. So if you kind of reflect back, what is one thing for each of you that you felt that the we could be the government, could be institutions, could be businesses, could be households, got right with the response to the earthquakes that we should begin doing in the face of COVID-19 or strengthen? I'll start with whoever's up for that one.
I guess, yeah. There was a lot of, when you look at what happened with the quake, I think New Zealand is famous for the fact that it actually took a plunge and got it right with these wage subsidies and things like that. So internationally, they tend to get bagged as not being very successful. New Zealand figured out a good way of doing it. It was high trust. They put it in place quickly, and it was overall pretty successful. None of these things are 100% off the shelf perfect, but it was good and it stood out. And so in this case, they've carried that through and done it in the same kind of high trust way. It will get bagged a bit because somebody will pinch a bit of money they shouldn't have and do things like that. But it's keeping the whole momentum there, and it's very quick, and that's good. I think one of the other things is that for individuals and households, it's that whole need to have a positive mindset and take initiatives. In this situation, in an earthquake, encouraging that the state can't do that for you. And then it's the whole thing as well is that leaders are going to have to keep on learning to, like the adventure race, you're in unfamiliar territory, keep on learning, collaborating, working together as a team. We did those things pretty well. They're not structural kind of things. They weren't set out as an official rule, but we did that pretty well as a community. And I think that's the sort of thing that we need to keep on doing as a wider community, New Zealand community, for this whole situation.
Okay, Nilikan, you had your hand up before. So what was your bouquet?
I'm going to say something, and I agree with Bernhard, that's exactly what we found. But I'm also going to say something quite different, and that is what impressed me most about people in Canterbury was how positive they were and how proactive they were. And that right in the beginning, that's what impressed me very much. Personally, I was never affected by the earthquake, but when I saw the kind of destruction around me, I was expecting people to be quite, dejected and so on, but that didn't happen. They quickly got up, dusted themselves, and this went on, jumped right back into it. So for me, in this crisis, it's exactly the same quality which is going to ensure success, and that is be positive and be proactive. And because, let's face it, New Zealand has got off very lightly in this crisis. And, we are not in Italy, we're not Spain, we're not UK, we're not USA, we're not France, and not even UK. We're not even Ireland, we're not even Singapore. So we have a lot to look forward to. And so if you have a proactive, positive kind of mindset, and we have done tons of research on business recovery following the earthquakes. And this mindset is one thing that has stood out as being a factor of success. And that's what I would recommend to leaders in this crisis. You're probably more resilient than you think you are, and your organizations are also more resilient than you think they are. And so just be proactive and be positive, and things will work out.
Roger?
In terms of positive thing, I tell the story about Big Brothers. At the Rhine time, we had, it was a very hard environment, and we had one or two very new leaders, and one of our directors ended up being a big brother to some of those leaders. And a big brother simply had an office down the corridor from that person, and was a big brother to sort of support them and help them think about how they're going to solve issues. I remember this guy just occasionally helping the guy write letters to staff or other communications, or help work out what sort of legal advice we needed. So I think there's a role here for directors being quiet big brothers and big sisters for staff who are often going to find this environment really tough. I think the other thing I'd sort of talk about is the need for, I think we talk about sort of the variety of people. Diversity of people is so useful in this sort of time. There was a time early on in the earthquake, remember we wanted to build these big overhead power lines into the eastern suburbs because all the underground cables had been demolished. And, you know, we decided we need to get the drawing signed off by the Civil Defence Controller, because if we signed the drawing, we could build anything we jolly well liked as long as he'd signed the drawing. You know, the RMA wasn't going to apply. And we're one of these young guys, this kind of guy who knows how to use all these cool tools, drew the most beautiful drawing where each pole was going to go across the eastern suburbs, where this new line was going to go. And I remember going past one of the older engineers, the old bastard. And he said, "Oh, Roger, don't give him that. Let's just get an aerial photograph of the area. We'll get the fattest felt pen we can find, draw a big fat line, and then we can put that line anywhere we like under that felt pen line." So I think sometimes we want the young, cool people on our side at these sort of times, but those old bastards have been around forever, are really, really useful at these times. So we need diversity in our organisations if we're actually going to get some things done. So big brothers, big sisters, but also keep your old bastards as well. You need them just as much as those young people who know how to use the social media.
Brilliant. That's certainly music to my ears. Now,
are you an old bastard or one of those young guys?
On the inside, just on the inside, you know, moderate on the outside. Now, Bernhard, did you have some slides that we can share just to explain?
Yeah, sure. And so this is really more of an overview for people who didn't do the other session 3 years ago or they've forgotten it. Just to give a quick overview of the sort of stuff that we found from our research. Just to round off that last question, I think one of the things that I'm noticing is really quite important is that while we have leaders that we're, you know, our political leaders, our medical leaders are being acclaimed in the media, part of the success of what's happening at the moment really belongs to the average Kiwi who's obeying lockdown, doing all the sensible things, looking after their family, trying to stay positive and things like that. So it's a bit like Roger's point about your diversity in your organisation. It's a doing it together kind of thing that I think is quite important too at the moment. Anyhow, just flicking back here now.
While you're getting that set up, I'll just ask a question of the other two around news, and I guess trust, and I get that the flow of news. So I mean, at the moment, I mentioned earlier, it is so much wall-to-wall news. You know, TV stand-ups. There's all the online news, all COVID-19, all the day. Every article, even if it's peripherally related, seems to have some section which repeats the information we already know. Is that helpful?
Well, I think again, it's very easy to get overwhelmed by news, and if you don't have a sense of discrimination, you can actually end up feeling quite dejected and in a negative kind of a mindset. So it's always useful to restrict the news and from trusted sources, and use common sense to filter out what you think is relevant and what's not. You know, what may be fake news. Okay? So early on in this crisis, I did a lot of research because I was retired, I had nothing else to do. And, you know, weeks, much before anyone said it, I said that, you know, people are going to be touting this hydroxychloroquine as a possible cure. It's not going to work. It has very serious side effects and so on. And then President Trump went ahead and promoted it. And now we have trials which had to be abandoned because people started dying, you know, in those trials. So things like that. And so always my advice is just use your intelligence and discrimination to filter out, because there's a lot of information out there and not all of it is really relevant.
Are you able to share those slides, Ben?
I do.
I'll let you do that now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is just to, Nilikan will chip in as we go through because he was half owner of this one as well, doing it with us. So this is going back to what we did in terms of the quake research that Lloyd talked about earlier. And just the link, I guess, is to give a quick overview of the sort of the trends that are coming through. So you've got this whole 2011 earthquake and all the casualties and the damage from that. And if you go forward from there to where we are now with COVID, you're seeing the same kind of thing of this volatile environment. As mentioned, we don't know how long the disease threat's going to continue. The estimates and the duration of the economic recession, everybody's got their own guess and they vary a heck of a lot. So it's a bit like the adventure through the middle of the hills. No one quite knows the territory there. Some of the patterns that are being talked about are these possibilities that we're going to end up with moving from our 2 decades worth or more of globalization to much more local kind of things. One of the interesting things that I'm finding at the moment is that there's whole new emphasis on resilience. And this is at an international level, and it's talking about resilience as a structural kind of thing. Just in time, lean, cost effectiveness was the mantra of the last few decades. And now all of a sudden there's this desire for security and resilience in the sense of actually having much more robust supply chains and resources there. And so we've got all these other possibilities coming down the line of consumer attitudes and behaviors changing and things like that. But as we go forward from there, all we know is we can guess that a lot of the major trends that we've been seeing already will probably be accelerated, and particularly the use of technology. If you go through any of the recent pandemics, epidemics and things like that, it's always technology online starts moving. But the thing that stands out amongst all this is that amongst all of the tragedy of these other events, it's the organizations that had it together enough and they were risk-taking to take some very calculated moves that progressed. And so you have SARS 17 years ago gave rise to these giants now of Alibaba and ones like that. And the pioneers are the ones who can see those opportunities and claim the field and move in before the others. So it's the classic threat and opportunity of any crisis. Where your organizations may sit, you've got the very traditional kind of stuff of your lifeline services and public sector, right through to perhaps your tourism organizations that are really seriously affected by the whole thing. And each of those cases, these principles we've discovered around resilience will apply. And so if it's even in the public sector kind of health and areas like that, it's that ability to learn and adapt to an unfamiliar situation. But we can't promise that there's a silver bullet to protect everybody in the extreme situations. So very briefly, just talking about resilience, we saw this, as Nilikant said at the beginning, it's very much a case of rapid adaptation under adverse circumstances, thrown into an unfamiliar situation and having to do a whole lot of adaptation in a very short time frame. There's 2 parts, and the first part is what people tended to know of the BCPs, continuity plans, emergency management procedures. All of those are vital, really important. But what wasn't being talked about was the adaptive resilience. And this is the issue of what happens that isn't covered by your plan, what the organization does on that ongoing basis during a crisis. And it's the same principle of this VUCA environment: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We found 6 themes. So we had over 200 interviews with leaders and organizations, thousands of pages of data from the whole thing. And from that, we did these in-depth studies of the organizations. Consistently, 6 things came through as standout important. One of them was around the leadership, 3 of them around cultures, the way the organizations run. And then there were 2, the resources and the context, were kind of specific to each individual organization. And so in that situation, we weren't looking as much in detail at the latter 2, but primarily on those first 4 that applied across all organizations. In terms of the leaders, one of the really important things we noticed with them was that they had this ability to tune into what was happening in the situation and perceive what were the issues that needed to be addressed, to adapt and to change their priorities based on what was happening there. They were strategic, they were risk takers. Those issues we talked about before in terms of communication, they were really good communicators. They weren't people who were locked into a rigid way of doing things. Their whole ethos, their way of going, their living their life was around learning. Every experience was a learning experience, and that transmitted out to the rest of the organization. These were people who understood other people and related to people. So they're empathetic, they're accessible, listening. They probably had a call center person told them that they were crap, that sort of thing. They were appreciative, they were affirming. The person knew it was okay to say that because they were okay. And there was that trust that we talked about earlier, that they would empower their people and say, we trust you to go on and do this. I'll be here to support you, but I'm not going to micromanage you. I trust you to do this. And they were very, very intentional about the 3 key cultures that they wanted to create in their organizations. It wasn't by chance. They did deliberately focus on these things. So there's those 3 key cultures that we'll be looking at. Now, look, and if you want to chip in on this one, it's around the valuing of employees. We've called it this people-centric attitude.
Yes, I think in the present context, that's going to be very important. And the simple idea here is that people need to feel valued. Because Roger talked about creating a culture where people trust you, so that's not going to happen if people don't feel valued. And we found that valuing employees, particularly in the earthquake context, there are 3 aspects to it. One was paying attention to their well-being. The other one was making sure that they were engaged. And the third was paying attention to their personal resilience. Again, I don't think you can give a kind of a general checklist of what's going to make people feel valued. It depends on the organization, depends on the setting, the context, and so on. But generally, I think we need to treat them, genuinely need to treat people as human resources, not as human costs. And the general tendency in any kind of crisis is to cut costs, is to make sure that you protect your, cash flow, earnings, and profits, and so on. So, what's the easiest cost to cut is the payroll. But I think that would be a mistake because going forward, the long-term survival of organizations depends on how valued those employees feel, and they're going to be the source of ideas, innovation, the kind of things that Roger talked about. Does that make sense?
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
The add-on to that is, I guess the concept is, have you got your people on your side? Do they trust you? Are they batting for you? Then that's what you need to go forward in this organization in a time of a crisis. The other part, the second one that goes with this is this whole ability to work together as a team, like your adventure. It's the same kind of thing, that nobody knows all of the answers to the situation. If you work in isolation, you're not going to get anywhere. If you have that team within yourself, or if you're talking to your Swedish tourists, whatever they are, gathering information from other people, it's the same kind of process. All of those players are going to be valuable. The more you can reach out, the more you can get that information, the more you're humble enough to learn or to share and exchange, that's equipping you. It's the social culture, so the social capital that you're building, and it's creating that culture in the organization. The siloed approach is pretty, it's a ball and chain. It's not taking these organizations forward. And then the final one is very dependent on having those first 2 in place, because if you want people to contribute and you want to learn as an organization, if they're feeling disengaged, they don't trust you, you're going nowhere. So this is a little bit like the pinnacle as you move on. If you've got those foundations of people feeling involved, if you've got people who want to contribute because they belong, and they're talking to other people, then you can take that forward in terms of learning. And as Nilikan said earlier on, it's that ability to rapidly learn and adapt and change in this totally unfamiliar situation that carries organizations forward. It's not a case of just organizational learning. It's that ability to, like Roger said, with the whole team of the old, the young, and everybody together pitching in their ideas, that you collectively put the stuff out on the table and you can take it forward as a group. You can sift through what you're going to do and see what's important. And it's those things that people pick up on and the insights that they'll have as you keep moving forward. It's not a single one exercise at the beginning. It's this whole business of learning in and during your crisis that takes them forward. And that's really the essence. Lloyd, you asked a question early on about if you have an organization it's mediocre health in terms of these things at the moment, how do you go forward? Well, it's like any of these things where you're building a culture. You can't change a culture overnight, and you have to start with the basics. And so the foundation, if we map it out this way, is to start off with that environment of getting your people involved in the sense of wanting to be part of this organisation. Then you can work on your collaboration. And finally, your learning can take place. You can't leap straight to the learning. You've got to have those foundations in place first.
It's always the way, isn't it? You can't rush to the end without going through those stages. Now, we have got some fantastic questions that I'd like to address. First of all, there's been a few questions around access to this information, and I can assure everybody that there'll be links afterwards, some really good booklets that actually cover off this information really well. So that will be passed on via email later on. Now, also, we've had some questions around business continuity plans, but I think you've covered that as well. So this isn't about being so prescient to have predicted this is a risk that was going to crystallize. It's more around the ability of organisations to react whatever the future holds for us, which we're never going to be able to predict perfectly. So I'll start with you, Roger. Next question is, where should the responsibility for resilience sit within a business? Should it sit with the CEO, the leadership team, with the board, with everyone in the organisation?
I don't think there's a simple answer. I think it sits across the organisation. I think the board has got a role. I think the board's first role is just to make sure they set a culture and a tone where the organisation is willing to reflect, is willing to be open to learn lessons. So that's the first thing the board does. Are they encouraging the organisation to review how they've gone when things have gone wrong and to have an open and frank discussion about how it's happened? The senior managers clearly have got a role in all this, but you also, I mean, the key thing, and we've talked about this, all the things the senior management are doing to try and build that culture throughout the organisation of open communication and trust and so on. So, I mean, it's the board, it's the senior managers, and then it's the senior managers then making sure they give the tools to the people further down the value chain so they can actually perform when things actually get difficult as well. So I don't think it sits in any one place at all.
And just again with you, Roger, as we move through the different phases, I guess, from the current phase, we have sort of addressed this one, but the current crisis phase, if you will, to the recovery phase, does the role of the board change, do you think, as we move phase?
So far, I mean, I think it does. I mean, so far, I've actually kept my board away from the senior managers because I kind of figured the boards can be prone to asking questions that just annoy the senior managers, sort of trivia that's just going to piss them off. I know my language isn't quite appropriate, but as time goes on, I will allow the board to have more to do with my senior managers because I think there is sometimes a risk in that formal board meeting that actually they just eat away at small issues. I think that the role of the board over time is just trying to get, in this next phase, is trying to get the management to sit back and reflect about what's gone well, what's gone badly, what are those true lessons, and try and get some honesty going.
Good. And now, look, the next question's for you. You've had time to reflect on this from your lovely setting there. So the question is, what do you think will be the main disruptions to business in the coming 6 to 12 months, and what needs to be done to get the best outcome for people?
It's a very interesting question. I've given it some thought, actually. And I've also looked at a whole bunch of stuff that these consulting organizations have been putting out. My own view is that the next 6 to 12 months, organizations will have to do two things, and they have to do it simultaneously. The first thing is to ensure business continuity and survival, and putting things back in restarting the business if they have been closed down, or scaling it up if they have been operating at a reduced scale, and so on. So we need to, the first 6 to 12 months is to make the business viable once again. That's one aspect, but simultaneously you'll have to do something else which is very different. And that is, you need to prepare for the future. Because after 12 months and 18 months, the world is going to be very different. The business environment is going to be very different. It'll be a lot more digital. Digital commerce will play a very big role in business operations, and a lot of business operations, in fact, business aspects will be digitized. So going forward beyond 12 months, you need to start looking at your value propositions, your business models, your channels, your key partners, your all the usual things that we look at when we want to modify our business model. And we found from our Canterbury, the earthquake research, that organizations which simultaneously paid attention to both current operations and future strategy, those are the ones that are most resilient. So I think that's what organizations should have to do. If you get too caught up in just current operations, then you won't have a future. On the other hand, if you spend too much time thinking about the future, you won't be viable to,
The master every stage of the process. Now, Bernhard, the next one's for you. It's an excellent question. We learn many valuable lessons from major events, but they're often the same lessons learned from previous events. How do we move from learning lessons to better implementation of those lessons?
Take personal ownership. It's as simple as that. One of the things I have heard is now, who was it? It was one of the key figures in the software world had actually done a simulation around 2006 and talked to his people about what would happen if there was a pandemic. And of course, it's pretty much paid out to plan as to what they talked about. There's no monopoly on actually knowing or investigating these things. It's the choice to actually go and do it that's critical. And I think the thing that Nilakant's just talked about is that we're not only looking at big crises like natural disasters or pandemics. There's going to be this rapid shift around digitization and technology that will catch people unawares. You don't want to be running a taxi company when Uber comes along. So that parallel is going to apply in many other places.
I've got another one for you, Bernhard, as well. This is a different one. Do you have any comments on managing small picture versus big picture thinking in the current situation?
Yeah, and it's very much like what Nilakant talked about before. It's that two-track ability to think of keeping your business running smoothly at the moment, the hygiene factors, getting the whole thing going properly, but you've got to be looking to the left and the right to see what's happening alongside you and what's moving, because it's going to be fast moving. So if you do have all these things, the sort of success formula that we saw in the earthquakes and applies in other crises is to have an empowered team who'll get on with running things, and as well to have people watching out for the big picture stuff, not micromanaging it.
Excellent. Now, Roger, one for you. Most of the responses to COVID have been from Wellington to date. What can we start to doing locally now?
Yeah, I know.
And you like this one? You've had.
Yeah, I mean, it's just hard. I mean, Wellington loves. Governments, they all love centralized solutions. They love same solution for everyone. I don't have an answer on this. I've been trying to persuade them to have different solutions, different regions of New Zealand, allow the regions to get going more quickly, because you can learn from those experiences. If you'd gone out of, level 4 and the Ashburtons and the Gisbornes of this world sooner, we would have learned how to do it. Perhaps there would have been lessons we could have taken. Here's the problem with government. Government loves these solid lines, simple rules. I can see Bernhard grinning away here. Why doesn't Bernhard have a go here?
No, I stay out of politics, sorry.
But politicians are fundamentally not good at disasters because they find ambiguity really difficult, because they have to make decisions and they can't revisit decisions. They only really want to talk to what's on the front page, not actually what really matters. They have trust. They won't work with their enemies. Often your enemies in this environment have very, very useful insights. So listen to your enemies. Your enemies, after the Christchurch earthquakes, Leanne Dalziel saw things that Jerry Brownlee just couldn't see. But they were political enemies. I remember Leanne Dalziel ringing me up on a number of occasions when I ran a Ryan saying, Roger, you're just being an idiot. Do this instead. Once I got the Sarah job, there were no phone calls like that. It was just a press release saying I was an idiot. So, I just think fundamentally politicians aren't good at disasters for a whole lot of these really fundamental reasons. It's very, very difficult for them, Yeah. They can't delegate. They've got all these fundamental characteristics that make it really tough for them to be really effective leaders. Although at the moment, I think the leadership actually looks pretty good.
we're coming to the end for those that have hung on with us. Thank you. Just a couple of questions to go. This is a good one to follow up on that last discussion. We'll start with you, Nilakant, this time. It'll be a short answer. How would you rate the government's response for New Zealand resilience out of 10? What is one additional action you would put in place if you were the Prime Minister?
You're talking about the current crisis. I think out of 10, I'd probably give them 9. They have done pretty well. But along with Roger, I'm not, I'm not in favor of centralized kind of management of disasters. So, those of us in the disaster management think we prefer a decentralized approach. But New Zealand is a small country, and I think a centralized approach has worked in this instance. But I don't think we should, if you sit back and look at and compare New Zealand with Australia, I mean, Australia with a very different leadership has done equally well, if not better than New Zealand. So, I think I'd give them 9. I think they should have listened to more criticism, and there were criticism about personal protective equipment for medical staff, and I saw the government getting very defensive about that. I think that was rather unfortunate. So, of course, these are my personal views.
Of course, Bernhard, I'm going to come to you next. I mean, you mentioned that you're not political, but you do get to mark assignments and observe things. So, what would be your score for the government out of 10?
Look, I think it's really interesting that, again, I'm with Nilakant. I'm talking about, the 9-10 sort of range there, or 9 out of 10.
Yep.
But I think one of the things that the public don't realise is the vast number of voices who are clamouring to get the government's attention at the moment. And so behind the scenes, there's so much lobbying of different groups. There's all sorts of people putting out their own statistics and own views. And I think it must be an incredibly tough position knowing the consequences of one wrong decision at this point, or being swayed by one group that doesn't have it together. That's quite an onerous kind of thing for anyone in that role. Yeah. The resilience, I think one of the key things, without trying to get too political, I'm analysing this from a leadership skills point of view rather than the person, is I think that Jacinda Ardern has done very well at getting that empathising and connecting with in the way that we want leaders to do. If you look at the contrasts of some of the overseas leaders, there's been that connection with people, that willingness to sit down and do Facebook from a laptop at home and things like that. That is, in terms of our rating of what connects with people, those are pretty good things. Not saying it's perfect, but if someone wants to take hints as to effective techniques in leadership, there's some effective stuff happening there.
Roger, I'll give you 30 seconds. What do you think?
No, look, I think it's been pretty good. I think trust in leaders is incredibly important in this environment. I mean, and the reality is, government for most of us actually doesn't have much of an impact on our day-to-day lives. But in this case, government has a huge impact on our lives. So us generally trusting Jacinda has made it much, much easier to get good quality outcomes here. I just implore them, this is much more than just saving lives from COVID. There's a whole lot of other impacts going on through the community, whether it's people, we're not going to be rich enough in 5 years' time to buy as good a cancer drugs as we otherwise would have been able to buy. We're going to be a poorer nation. This slavishly chasing a single KPI, I get irritated by that, but I think that's very difficult in this very political, in this environment we have.
And we'll move on to our very final question. What's your view? We'll start with you, Roger, on how best to go about getting the senior staff within the public service and the government leaders understanding the environment, as I guess touching on what you're raising there, and the importance of it as it relates to governance and building resilience in these tough times.
Well, I'd drag them out of Wellington. I actually think the public servants we've got are actually a pretty good bunch. I really do. But I think the more they get out of Wellington and get to see the real experiences and the real stories, the more likely we are to see outcomes which aren't just purely focused on minimising the COVID numbers. Because I think this crisis is much more than that. It's about our long-term economic survival. So drag them out of Wellington, show them some real stuff, and make sure they really get connected.
Now, we'll just finish up. So one final word from each of you. So Nilakant, what's your takeaway for everyone?
My takeaway is that we are lucky as a country. We are fortunate in having a leadership team which is open, relatively transparent and can be trusted. I think the future, despite all gloomy predictions, is actually looking very good for New Zealand. So let's just be proactive and positive and focus on what we can do differently 12 to 18 months from now, and start paying attention to new ideas, innovations, and new business models.
And Bernhard?
Like Nilakant, I'm very impressed by what's happened. I think one of the things that we need to look at is if we've done it this well here, and we've actually had behind the scenes some really good discussion between government and business around this situation, as well as the medical stuff, what can we learn for our other big wicked problems like climate change and things like that? So if I can spend 4 weeks without driving my car because I'm worried some bug's going to kill me, what else can we do as a collective action, as a group of people in the society, New Zealanders, to address those other wicked problems?
And Roger will give you the last word.
Well, I mean, I saw this question being more, what's the takeaway we could take away? People listening in could take. I mean, we have this. One of my great learnings from this whole thing is about how do you actually set up organisations so there's people around them who the staff trust, not just the CEOs, not just the senior managers and the board. We had this experience at Orion where we brought in a structural engineer early on who just wandered around the organisation, making the staff feel safe that the building wasn't going to collapse on them, and it was really successful because people trust other people. They don't trust drawings. They don't trust formulas. They trust people. And so what we've done lately is we've brought a GP into this business and give everybody confidence they can still come to work safely. So that whole thing of having a face, having a real person people can connect with, to get their advice, to hear that this process we've got going, these people working together are safe as long as we do it this way, presented by a GP they've got to know over the last month, has been really successful. Think about other people, other relationships you need right now in organisations to give your staff the confidence and the courage to continue to come to work. And GPs are about half the price of a lawyer or an accountant. And they've all got heaps of time at the moment.
The accountants and lawyers listening will love that one to finish. Now, I'd just like to assure everybody who has sent through a question asking, will this be available? And yes, the recording of this will be available on YouTube, and so that will be shared via email afterwards. I'd like to acknowledge the Institute of Directors. Thank you very much for your support of this event, and of course to the University of Canterbury. All of the panelists, including myself, have strong links to the University of Canterbury, and thank you very much for putting on this event. And I'd like to wish you a very good evening, and certainly keep safe and well, and yeah, all the best with developing adaptive resilience in your organisation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bernhard. Thank you, Roger.
So yeah.
Thanks, Lloyd.